Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. This is Alicia at CSAFE in Iowa State. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going, so I don't have a slide to tell you about coming events, but everything that is coming is on our website. So please go check our website, www.forensicstats.org. Today we have Charles Fowlkes from Computer Science at University of California, Irvine, and he'll talk to us about matching footwear class characteristics. So take it away, Charles.
Thank you very much. So sort of core activity in footwear impression examination is to try to understand whether a particular shoe is likely to have left some impression at a crime scene. And examiners generally sort of break the aspects of footwear evidence down into two broad categories. One are class characteristics. So these are properties of the shoe which are imparted during the manufacture of the shoe, the make, the model, the size, sort of characteristics of the mold in which the tread was cast, and then acquired characteristics, which are changes to outsole shape that happen after manufacture. So general wear patterns and damage and so on. So if you tuned in for last month's CSAFE webinar, Leslie Hammer gave a very nice presentation on how this type of evidence is collected and analyzed by practitioners and some of the challenges there. And so the goal of my talk today is to discuss some ideas about how we can bring computational and statistical analysis tools in order to aid that interpretation of footwear evidence. So I'll sort of discuss a couple different topics, primarily focused on how can we automatically extract and match features of patterns between test impressions and crime scene evidence, and then also discuss some of the challenges in sort of assembling large-scale data sets that can help us quantify the diversity of patterns in tread impressions, and finally a bit about how to measure and model a relation between sort of the 3D shape of the outsole and tread impression evidence. And here our focus of our work is really primarily on looking at these class characteristics of tread. So as a little sort of motivation for this, we can talk about a couple applications. So one is sort of how we can expand investigative tools by using automated matching and retrieval techniques. So you could imagine that if you have some crime scene evidence, you would like to try to match it against a database of reference tread patterns and say develop a short list of candidate shoes that might match that impression. And this provides you a way to sort of aid the investigative process. And we're also interested beyond that sort of practice in the long term of really understanding something more about the statistics of tread pattern features. So if we look across tread patterns and impressions, we could ask sort of how valuable are different types of impression evidence in terms of making class level determinations. And if we want to really do that at large scale, sort of understand the diversity of tread patterns out there, we ultimately need some kind of automated analysis to just handle the sort of large quantities of data and really estimate these types of diversity characteristics at scale. So in order to do this, we want to be able to take, say, images of test impressions, images of crime scene evidence, and be able to automatically try and match between them. And there's some challenges in doing this. To begin with, there's sort of a huge diversity in the actual visual appearance of crime scene evidence, whether it's prints left in blood or dust or actual impressions in soft materials. The image data describing that evidence is highly variable in appearance compared to, say, the test impressions that we might take of a tread. And another sort of challenge is that there's really not a lot of examples of sort of data sets which characterize this kind of pairing between crime scene evidence and corresponding test impressions that we could use to optimize and evaluate systems. So, despite these challenges, there are some existing tools that are used in practice. So there's a number of commercial footwear databases which come with systems for trying to match class characteristics, Sidecar, Soulmate, Everspry, Blue Star, which is the software used by the UK police force. And these databases consist of collections of reference patterns and then tools to help you sort of query that database, either by manually coding the tread elements that you see on the bottom of the shoe or trying to do some more fully automated matching. And so these systems are useful, but it's still challenging to be able to actually search through them effectively. And another challenge is that they need to be constantly maintained as new footwear appears on the market. So there's also a substantial body of work sort of in the academic world, just thinking about the underlying process of automated matching. And that's really where we're trying to come to bear on this problem. How can we develop sort of better techniques for doing that? So if I'm thinking about matching, say, an image of a test impression to crime scene evidence, there's, in broad terms, sort of two key steps in building up such an algorithm. So the first one is sort of a problem of correspondence. So what elements in those two images should I be comparing? And then once I've kind of determined that correspondence, how should I quantify their similarity? So one way to think about correspondence is really determining sort of what part of a particular candidate shoe corresponds to crime scene impression. So I might say, it aligns here, or I want to align it here, I want to align it here. And in practice, we don't know a priori exactly where on the shoe tread pattern that crime scene mark came from. We might also have to search over orientations or more general kinds of deformations that could happen due to bending of the outsole or slippage or so on. So if we've sort of aligned two images, then the other thing we need to do is develop some sort of measure of similarity. So I say, are these two corresponding points similar enough to think that these match? And a simple place to start might be to look at the pixel brightness values at corresponding locations in each image and ask, are they highly correlated with each other as I move around to different corresponding locations? So that works in some cases. Here you can already see a case where it doesn't quite work. That is, the impression on the left has exactly opposite the contrast of the impression on the right. It's dark where the other one is light and so on. So in this case, they're in fact anti-correlated. And so this kind of difficulty makes you move towards more sort of abstract features. So you might say, let's look at, instead of the brightness of the pixel values, sort of identify edges in each image and say, or the presence of edges at corresponding locations, highly correlated, or maybe the presence of other features, corners, circles, and so on. So that sort of challenge of coming up with features from the image is one which computer vision has worked on for a long time. How can we robustly extract features like edges and corners or other shapes in the tread? And the recent developments along these lines have been building on technology known as convolutional neural networks. So these are procedures for sort of processing an image and extracting lots of informative features. They're structured in a hierarchical way. So here there's multiple layers of this model denoted by boxes in this slide. And at each layer, we sort of compute some features from the layer before. You can imagine the initial input is a color image, and maybe the first layer looks for things like edges and so on. And these layers, sort of the key features to keep in mind is they're organized still spatially. So like a spatial map where each location, when I look in that layer, I have a set of numbers which are features associated with that location in the image. And these models have, over the last few years, become very dominant in sort of image analysis, automated image analysis. In particular, they were often trained to perform tasks like visual categorization. So given an input image, can I decide what object am I looking at? Is this a cat or a dog or a car or so on? But it ends up that once you've trained one of these models, the features that it learns to make use of in identifying objects are actually very useful for other visual tasks. So in particular, if you sort of dig into the layers of these models, you discover at sort of the lowest layers, the features that are being extracted from the image might correspond to things like edges at a particular orientation or blobs of colors or so on. And as you move up to higher layers of this model, you find more kind of mid-level features, corners, circles, and so on. And at the highest layers, whole sort of parts of objects this model has been trained to recognize. And so this is appealing because these sort of mid-level features that are being represented in these models are sort of at a right scale to capture local patterns in the tread in a robust sort of way that we can use to compare. So our basic sort of strategy for matching a crime scene query print to a database of test impressions is going to be to sort of search over possible alignments between that crime scene query and a test impression. And given an alignment, we're going to extract these features using the convolutional neural net and then compare them with some similarity metric. And from this, we'll get a score, how similar these are, and attempt to sort of return the most similar test impressions in a database. So how do we actually compute that similarity? Well, the idea I described before of looking at correlations between pixels is actually a fairly good one. So traditionally, people have looked at things like normalized cross-correlation. So if I sum over all the pixels in the, say, the left image X and the right image Y here at each location, I've got some pixel brightness, and I want to sort of look at the correlation of those brightness values. And I normalize this by subtracting off the average brightness and dividing by the variance of the pixel values. And those, that sort of normalization gives me robustness to say variations in the overall brightness of an image or variations in the overall contrast. So this works great for sort of grayscale images. It's been used in a lot of cases for things like tracking an object moving around in a video, but in our case, we have these sort of multiple channels. So in our convolutional feature map, we have not just a single brightness, but multiple measurements associated with each location. And so we sort of extend this idea by summing up the correlations across many of these channels. So we use what we call a multi-channel normalized cross-correlation. We sum over the channels. Within each channel, we're looking at the correlation, normalized correlation between corresponding locations in the two images. And so it ends up that this sort of simple measure of similarity applied to these convolutional feature maps is actually very effective at solving this problem of matching crime scene prints to test impressions. So the way we evaluate this is using a benchmark data set assembled by Adam Karolewski at Basel. And this data set consists of around 1,000 lab test impressions, which we're thinking of as our database. And then there's a set of 300 crime scene prints, which are the queries. And so for each of those crime scene prints, we can match it into the database and look at the following question, which is, as we start sorting through the database in terms of match score, how many database images will we have to look at until we found the correct match for this print? And so in the graph here, you're seeing a plot, which is as a function of the percentage of the database that we've looked through, how many times do we find a correct match? And so in this case, say at a few percent, we up at 60 or 70% of the time find the correct match in our short list of images. And as it ends up, this sort of simple comparison of cross-correlation of these features kind of outperforms other systems that people have proposed for analyzing this data. So this is, to our knowledge, sort of the best current performing algorithm for this particular task. And interestingly, there's really no learned parameters here. We're just taking a model which has been trained on some other data. It's not specific to shoe prints in that sense. It's just a generic measure of image similarity. So these models, of course, can be optimized. And if we kind of look at the retrieval results here, I'm just showing some examples on the left of a query image and on the right of different test impressions retrieved from the database. You see, to start with, some intuition about how difficult this matching task is. That is, the crime scene impressions here are quite a bit different than the test impressions that we're trying to match them to. They're much sort of more cluttered and have different kinds of contrast and noise, if you like, in them, or background texture. But we're still able to a large extent, sort of make reasonable matches into the database. But you could imagine that we might want to adapt the system to be more specific to this particular modality. And so we've also built versions of the system where we actually do some additional sort of optimization. That is, if we have training data which shows us sort of crime scene prints and their associated matched test impression, then we can try to optimize the parameters of the system to sort of make the similarity score for those images high and make the similarity score for non-matching pairs low. And in particular, we can do things like assign different weightings to the different feature channels, and we also transform features before we compute the normalized correlation in order to sort of better align between these domains. And so this is a thing which allows us to push the performance even further. So this is another kind of performance evaluation carried out on a data set collected by collaborators in the Israeli police force, which again consists of roughly 400 test impressions and 137 crime scene prints. And here we're sort of characterizing, if we choose a particular threshold for whether something's a match or not, what is the precision with which we sort of return correct matches, and also what is the recall, how often do we find the correct print within the database. And so the blue curve here represents that kind of baseline of correlation, and the red and orange curves represent variants of this model, which have been further optimized by training with some subset of the data. So this sort of use of machine learning tools to kind of optimize our similarity metric is quite powerful thing. The difficulty here in some sense is that the system is adapting to the statistics of this particular data set, and we have to ask ourselves, will this sort of work in general? Do these numbers mean things in the real world? And so the second topic that I want to talk about is sort of where we can expand this available data. So in particular, if we look at the two data sets I presented so far, this data set from Basel, collected by Adam Karlewski, this Israeli police force data set, in some sense, these are relatively small samples, so they're incredibly valuable for sort of research purposes, but they depict, say, hundreds of different impressions and queries, and so the statistics of these data sets are somewhat limited, and in a large part, kind of lots of recent progress and problems of computer vision, of matching images or recognizing image content has kind of been driven by the wide availability of data. So we'd like to be able to sort of make use of more data first to sort of train our algorithms, if you like, to learn better parameters for our algorithms, but also in order to actually have a good evaluation of those algorithms. And so this has sort of pushed us to think about ways in which we can collect more data in this venue. And one interesting resource which is available is retail data online. So in particular, if you go to websites which sell shoe products, you discover that many of them include high-resolution photos of the shoe tread. And so over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been assembling a data set by going to these online retailers and collecting images and some additional product metadata. And so this starts to get more towards this view of sort of the collection of possible tread patterns that are out there. So in this case, we've collected on the order of 200,000 images of roughly 80,000 different products. And if we sort of go to these websites every month and see how many sort of new products are appearing, you discover that there's really a flood of new footwear, roughly 4,000 new shoes a month we see just on a couple websites that we look at. So this is sort of interesting for a number of reasons. The first thing that we're trying to do is just sort of corral this data and organize it in a reasonable way so that we can understand what's out there. So we've been developing just a simple kind of interface that lets you browse through this data in a web form, sort of query for different categories of shoes and take a look at visually what's there. So we see some breakdown of shoes across different categories and different brands. So this is, again, information provided by the retailers of what's on these websites. But we also get very interesting visual data. So for a given shoe, we see multiple images of the tread pattern. We also collect side views of these shoes. And this starts to capture some sort of diversity of the products which are out there at scale. So these are, again, a few examples of each kind of column here represents a particular product, and you see variations in, say, the color and so on of these different items. So what does this data let you do? Well, for one, you can start to see that there's a huge variety of actual tread patterns that are manufactured, and see what that looks like across individual products. These images are collected under very controlled sort of conditions, which is nice. So typically the shoe is placed in this sort of light box with very diffuse light shining in on the sides. And so the kind of conditions under which these images are collected are quite controlled, and they provide lots of interesting detail. And so we can start to look at some variations within a product. Some of this comes from having variants of a product, say, cast in different colors, but also photos that are taken by different retailers of the same product, which we can correlate here. So we don't have large numbers of images of specific products, but there are some where we have more than one, of which you're seeing examples here. There's other sort of interesting variations. So some variations in the way these are lit when they're photographed, some lit better than others. On the right, you see an interesting case where there's sort of light shining through from the back of the shoe, which makes it a bit more difficult to see what is the tread pattern. And there's also some challenges here in that these photos, even though they're nominally of the shoe tread, often depict other parts of the shoe uppers and so on. So our goal is really to try to make use of this data and use it as a proxy for understanding the diversity of tread features that are out there and how they're related to class characteristics. So I should say there's some inherent limitations here. We're typically missing information, say, on sizing or mold variations that you might like to have. And of course, the statistics of this data set are not necessarily reflective of kind of practical investigative circumstances. This is sort of a slice of the world of shoes, which is for sale online, not in a particular case. And we only have sort of a few example photos of most shoe designs. So there's not sort of this case of being able to train algorithms to match between different shoes. And of course, the final kind of aspect here that we need to think about is that these outsole photos themselves are, in some sense, very different than the impressions I was showing before. You see parts of the tread which wouldn't be in contact with the surface. So despite these limitations, sort of the exciting thing about this is that it really casts a much wider net over the space of tread patterns and provides some data to start doing that kind of analysis. So in regards to this last question, we'd really like to say something about how we might make use of this data when comparing to tread impression evidence. And so I want to sort of talk about a final idea, which is measuring and modeling the relation between the 3D outsole shape and the impression evidence that we looked at before. So there's a couple motivations for thinking about 3D tread. So the first is we'd really like to expand the capability of our sort of matching system. And so in particular, if we could find a way to sort of match impressions to these outsole photos, suddenly we could make use of this online data and be able to sort of maintain that resource and kind of track the appearance of these new tread patterns. The second, I think, motivation is that in terms of kind of methodology and practice, I think there's lots of prospects here for thinking about 3D to 3D matching. So in particular, sort of the technology for acquiring 3D shapes of objects is becoming more and more ubiquitous. And if you think about problems of kind of evidence archival, this is a very nice way to represent that data. So rather than, say, just having photographs of a test impression, to also have sort of a 3D scan of the shape of the physical object is appealing. And I'd say the final motivation here is that the characteristics of that evidence really are somehow tied to the 3D tread shape. So if we think about problems like modeling the spatial distribution of acquired characteristics and accidentals, that depends very much on what parts of the tread are in contact with the ground. If we want to sort of start talking about how to quantify wear patterns in general aren't really well kind of characterized by a test impression. Volumes of rubber that have worn away to some extent you see that in the test impression, but it's difficult to really quantify how much has worn away. Whereas if you really understood the volume of that material, that would give you an idea of what's going on. And lastly, if you want to understand sort of how marks are generated, that is how impressions relate to sort of the physical object, are those impressions a function of the physical object, then that really requires kind of thinking about the 3D shape of the tread pattern. So kind of the conceptual picture here up top, we've got this physical object that is the shoe. And so if we have some sort of data which tells us about the 3D shape and the material, then from that we can think about, say these photos of outsoles, which we were looking at before, are a function of that 3D shape and some kind of illumination and viewpoint. How did I take the photo of that shoe? On the other hand, these sort of impression, that 3D shape along with some mechanical and dynamical forces which leave this impression. And so both of these kind of share, in some sense, this underlying connection to the 3D shape of the shoe. And so this has motivated us to start looking at how we might sort of fill in some of the arrows in this diagram. Can we map from photos to 3D shape, or from 3D shape to impressions, and so on? So one step along these lines is to think about actually scanning in 3D shapes of shoes. We've used a system here which is known as structured light stereo scanning. So I have a pair of cameras looking at this object, and in this case we project some patterns onto the object to make it easy to correspond locations on the surface between the two cameras and triangulate those points on the surface in order to recover a 3D depth map of the shape of the surface. So this is sort of a nice technique. It doesn't require kind of contact with the surface. So this would be applicable not only to sort of shoes, but potentially to acquisition of evidence at a crime scene. And in some sense, this technology is something which is increasingly becoming a commodity. So people have Microsoft Kinect sensors in their homes, playing video games, performing essentially this kind of function. There's now commercial kind of desktop scanners that let you build these kinds of 3D models as well. And so what you get out from this now is not just a photograph of the tread pattern, but an actual recording of the 3D shape. So here the colors in this figure represent the depth to the surface, with the darker colors being closer to the camera. And you can acquire by imaging sort of shapes of different treads. And of course, in this case, the shoe is sort of sitting on a platform with a camera pointing at it, so it doesn't capture exactly the shape of the shoe when it's sort of loaded and flexed against a contact surface. But this gives you lots of sort of rich information about that 3D shape. So the other sort of pieces that we'd like to think about, so say, how does this outsole imagery relate to the 3D shape? In this case, this is sort of a computer graphics problem. If we know the shape of the shoe and the material it's made out of, can we understand what a photograph of it would look like? And this is something which is also quite feasible. So here you're seeing rendered examples of a sort of a synthetic or artificial tread pattern where we've manipulated, say, the shininess of the rubber or the coloration of the rubber. And this is something that's sort of possible to do in the context of trying to understand these large collections of product images. We can simulate to a large extent the sort of lighting conditions under which those product photos were taken and relate what's in the photo to the 3D shape of the shoe. And the other sort of arrow that we saw was, could we model something about the physical generation of the evidence from that 3D shape? And so this is, in many ways, a much more complex kind of problem. It depends a lot on the surface and the tread material mechanics, sort of the flexing and loading of the shoe, and the dynamic sort of gait and distortion of the pattern as people walk, particularly over soft surfaces. But we can start to think about sort of simplified models of this from the scanned 3D shape. We can at least estimate fairly well some prediction of what would be the contact surface. So that is, ignore parts of the tread pattern, say, that wouldn't be in contact with a rigid surface, assuming some small kinds of elastic deformations of the tread. So again, this would give us a model for going from 3D shape to impressions of various sorts. And the kind of final thing that we would ultimately like to do is go directly from these sort of photographs of treads to predictions of the impression left by the outsole. And so we could ask the question, can we, without actually knowing the shape, sort of make this direct prediction? And so we've started to work in this area, and we can think in this case of a problem of kind of regressing from an input image to an output image. So the approach we take here, again, uses this sort of neural network technology to train a regression model which performs image to image regression. And if you like what's happening inside this model, is it's really trying to learn something about the shading pattern and how it relates to the 3D shape of the shoe. So in the example up top, you see these sort of shadows cast by the tread elements due to the lighting coming in from an angle. And so that's suggestive of the shape of that tread element. And in fact, we can, in some preliminary experiments, sort of demonstrate that this is feasible, that if we sort of look at lots of paired examples of photographs of the tread and actual test impressions associated with that tread, test impressions might look like. So over here on the right, you're seeing an example of an input image and a predicted test impression in comparison to the actual test impression. So these aren't by any means sort of perfect, but they get us a long ways towards this problem of being able to actually match kind of test impressions to things which are more like outsole photos. So to sort of summarize, I've talked about 3 different components here. So the first component is being able to do automatic extraction and matching of features between test impressions and crime scene evidence. We think this is going to be a very sort of useful tool, but it depends on having large reference collections of databases which we can perform that matching against. So there's a suggestion here that we have the capability to do this, but in some sense we need to be able to develop these sorts of reference data sets. And one approach to doing that is to make use of these online photo collections, but that comes with a difficulty that we don't have more than just a photograph of the outsole. And so in this case, our strategy for sort of making use of that data is to think about ways of modeling the appearance of that and the appearance of the test impression in order to be able to match directly to that sort of data. So I'll go ahead and stop there and open myself up for questions. I'd like to acknowledge 2 students, Bailey Kong and James Sabankik, who have done a large amount of the work on this project, and Deva Ramanan at CMU, as well as the folks who provided some of the data sets that we made use of.
Thank you so much, Charles. We open it up for questions from the audience now. No questions from the audience? Oh, somebody. What's that? So the question is from Marty Herman, and it is whether the UCI database is available for others to use.
Yeah, so at this point, we're sort of trying to package it up and make it publicly available. So certainly the collection of images right now as sort of raw data, we're happy to sort of share with people. We're in the process of sort of making this web accessible version of the database robust enough for folks to use. So that's certainly the plan in the short term, is to make that publicly available.
Great. So, sorry, I guess we'll put a link to it from the CSAFE website, so anybody interested in using this data or other data, go to resources, and when the data are ready for public, we'll just link to them. Any other questions?
Yeah, that was a great talk. Thank you. I was just wondering, when you're doing those test impressions and you compare them to the impressions that you get based on the predictions from the neural network. Yeah, 48. Those test impressions, does it matter whether there's actually or how do you get those test impressions? Are there actually people inside the shoes? Does it matter who's inside those shoes?
So the test impressions that we're using right now were sort of test impressions that have been collected by different groups. And in this case, they're sort of in the lab test impressions. So, you know, someone sort of carefully making that test impression, you know, the expectation would be that that impression varies depending on, you know, who's wearing the shoe, if I understand your question. So certainly the gait and the sort of loading affects that. And there's been, to my knowledge, a little bit of work in trying to understand the sort of variability in test impressions, say, across subjects or even within one person sort of repeatedly taking the same test impression. For the purposes of trying to match the class characteristics, that variability, I think, is sort of secondary. For us, the problem right now is really just being able to kind of make out all the tread elements which are present there in order to be able to sort of match at the class characteristic level.
Yeah, so is left shoe, right shoe, I guess that's part of the class characteristics. So how much of regular use of shoes would come in as class characteristics? So, yeah.
So, you know, in this setting, class characteristics really refer to things which are, say, properties of the mold that the shoe was manufactured with.
Okay.
So we think of them as kind of when the shoe was manufactured, what characteristics were imparted to the shape of the rubber. And so the distinction is between that and characteristics which are acquired during use.
Thank you. Other questions?
Do you think that for those acquired characteristics, do you think that 3D imaging can be particularly useful for those?
Yeah, so
in some sense, you want to know a lot about that nick in the shoe or something, and you want to know its depth.
Yeah, so the question here was for the acquired characteristics, will the 3D imaging be useful in that context? And so I think the answer is very much so. So one of the details is you really need to image at high enough resolution that you're sort of acquiring those details accurately. So something that's a very small kind of cut, which right now is still, you know, visible in the test impression, really understanding the geometry of that cut requires some, you know, sort of fidelity, but I think there's no sort of serious technical challenges there in terms of getting that fidelity from sort of optical scanning. The other aspect, which I think, you know, if you consider something like where there's some bulk of rubber being eroded off the tread, then that's a case where the kind of 3D scanning could be very useful in really quantifying, okay, what's the difference between this wear pattern and the original, say, shoe as it came off the assembly line?
I think there's another question.
The usefulness of treating your algorithm of test impression with adhesive films compared to, say, the Everose scan?
So I think in general right now, I've looked a bit at the Everose data. And so we chatted some with folks at the UK police force. And they showed us also some of the data they've been collecting in sort of their setting. And so the Everose, when it's sort of clean and fresh, gives very high quality scans, but in general, it's still not at the resolution of sort of the test impressions, say, that I've been showing here in terms of detail. So for example, the sensor on the surface is covered with fabric, and so you see texture of that fabric which comes through in the scanner. And so I would say, it's much more automated. You simply walk across it, but the fidelity is not as high. So in terms of class characteristics, though, it's quite effective. So capturing the sort of, say, if I just want to identify make, model, and size, then for that it's very effective.
Charles, I have a question. Have you given up on that 3D scanner?
Oh. I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Well, where you put the shoe on gel type surface. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So we've been working on that. There's sort of some challenges with the gel-based scanner. So it gives kind of very high fidelity information, but the gel itself is not particularly robust. So if you have dirt on the shoe and you put it down against the gel, that dirt can disrupt the gel and so on. And so it's sort of there's some, I think, material engineering challenges there to be worked out before that will kind of become generally useful. So we've so far we've been kind of focusing on the structured light scanning just because it's sort of more robust in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? All right then, if there's no questions, we thank Charles for a wonderful webinar, and we'll post the slides on the CSAFE website. If anybody would like, actually we'll post the webinar on the CSAFE website, so if anybody wants to listen to it again, you will be able to do so. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.